Welcome back. So today we're going to discuss a few of the ideas that we've been investigating in recent weeks, including Aristotle's rhetorical framework of ethos, logos, and pathos. And we will look at them in relation to this week's readings on Baldwin and Adichie. And what I want to do is sort of think about this framework and how we can apply it to texts. Because many times when students learn about ethos, logos, and pathos, the definitions will more or less make sense, right? When you kind of read it on paper, you you might feel like you have a handle on it, but then when you're asked to apply it to a text, there's a problem, right? Because texts are very messy. They're making references to things outside of themselves in the form of allusions. They're sometimes Writers are sometimes being ironic or hyperbolic, and there's a certain messiness to writing, even in very well structured logical writing. There's often, it's open to different interpretations, and so it can be a little tricky to kind of pin down like what mode is a writer working in a given instance, right? And then compounding the problem is that this three-part framework is a little bit artificial in the sense that I think most writers are probably not thinking about these three modes consciously every time they employ them, right? It may be kind of more organic in the way that they decide to kind of use ethos or use an appeal to emotion in the case of pathos. And so it can be hard for us as readers to pin down which mode they're in. And then I think on top of that, sometimes they're in more than one mode at the same time. And so I want to kind of look at a few specific examples and see if we can clarify our understanding of this framework, because it's really useful for your own writing if you can start to kind of consciously think about which mode you're in say in a given paragraph. Okay, so let me share my screen. Okay, so I call this redescribing fear. Redescription comes up certainly in The Danger of a Single Story by Adichie. And it also comes up in a philosopher I'm going to introduce to you named Richard Rorty. And but the reason I was focusing on fear is that Baldwin talks a lot about fear, and so does Adichie. Um, and I think like one of the ways these writers think about autobiographical writing and even story writing in general. I should mention, by the way, both of these authors are novelists who have also written significant amounts of work in a kind of first person autobiographical nonfiction vein, right? And sometimes it's interesting to read fiction writers when they're writing nonfiction, because you can sometimes kind of get a peek behind the curtain, if you will, into understanding how they think about their fictional work, right? And so both of these writers describe sort of instances in which they felt fear and got over it, or viewed storytelling as a way to overcome fears or to kind of create a less afraid version of oneself. Okay. All right. So I wanted to start off by pointing out one of the writers that Adichie refers to. She actually makes several allusions in her short essay. Among them are Bret Easton Ellis, the American novelist he's still working, actually, kind of comes to prominence in the 90s. Um, who else? Alice Walker. I think there's also kind of a veiled allusion to John Milton, the author of Paradise Lost. And then she mentions Mourid Barghouti, the author of Aysal Ramallah. He's a Palestinian poet and memoirist. And I wanted to I think, whenever you come across allusions in writing, it's really great to go track those down and just do a little bit of research and see, okay, what might it be about this person that the source material author found interesting? And This is a line from his book, I Saw Ramallah, that I thought was kind of related to some of the things we're thinking about. So Barghouti writes, but it is the land. There's nothing else for us. And for us, there is to live here, thus, like us, like one who has long been pursued and has no escape left, but to turn around and face the horror, standing to decide how to survive. Now, here he's talking about in sort of historical terms, he's referencing the dispossession of the Palestinian people of their homeland. But I think more generally, he's describing the problem that we all have, which is, the challenge of facing our fears, and also this question, which I put in italics here, of deciding how to survive. Right now, I think many of us maybe go through our day-to-day lives not thinking of our survival as something that we decide or not, right? But writing opens up this space to actually take a step back and think about, how am I going to live? How am I going to survive? Is there perhaps a better way to be living? But of course, that mission or that project is often beset by fears. Okay, and so this is the kind of dialectic that I think all of these writers are dealing with in one way or another. Okay, so in Letter from a Region in My Mind, this is Baldwin's autobiographical piece from 1962. Let me move this out of the way. He's talking about being about a 14-year-old boy, and he has a kind of tense relationship with his father, who's a preacher, and he's worried about getting kind of recruited to the streets in Harlem, right? He doesn't want to become part of the kind of criminal underworld of New York City, but he also doesn't feel like he fits in very easily in any other situation, and he ends up taking refuge in the church. Um, but he has this interesting passion about his sense of fear that kind of dominates this part of his life. So he says, I defended myself as I imagined against the fear my father made me feel by remembering that he was very old fashioned. Also, I prided myself on the fact that I already knew how to outwit him. To defend oneself against a fear is simply to ensure that one will one day be conquered by it. Fears must be faced. As for one's wits, it is just not true that one can live by them. Not, that is, if one wishes really to live. That summer, in any case, all the fears with which I had grown up and which were now a part of me and controlled my vision of the world rose up like a wall between the world and me and drove me into the church. Okay, now, a few things about this. He sort of reiterates or echoes the point that Barghouti makes, that fears have to be faced. And I think it's interesting to think about why writing feels like a medium in which people can do this, right? Like, what is it about our day-to-day life or spoken language that maybe doesn't always um, give us the time or the psychological space to face our fears? But the sentence that I thought was really fascinating and frankly a little mysterious to me is this italicized one. As for one's wits, it is just not true that one can live by them, not that is if one wishes really to live. Now, why is it the case? I don't think it's obvious, at least not to me, that one you can live by your wits, but you can't really live, right? So that's a kind of mysterious distinction that Baldwin is making. Wits would refer to, cleverness. I think he's invoking improvisational thinking, right? The kind of solutions you come up with on the fly. And these are sort of, maybe living by one's wits would maybe denote something like survival mode, right? Just getting through the day, getting out of a tricky situation. But Baldwin is saying that might be enough to get by, but it's not enough to kind of fully self-actualize. And so I want to kind of just introduce that as a question that can kind of hover over this conversation. Um, because I think that when we get to the section on Richard Rorty, I think Rorty kind of has an answer to this. Okay. Okay. So let's think a little bit about logos. And again, you can find definitions for these three terms in the Purdue OWL webpage that I posted in Canvas. You can also just Google them. But logos is essentially the mode of rhetorical argumentation in which writers are using logic, reason, data. They're trying to come across as very objective, non-emotional for the most part. It's a kind of logos tends to have a kind of a flat affect, meaning it's not super emotional. It's kind of like pharmaceutical ads, let's say, that are describing, symptoms that a medicine will help cure. That would tend to be working in a logos centric mode. Okay. Now, in The Danger of a Single Story, Adichie writes the following. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. Okay, now, as I was reading through this essay this time, I was thinking that, when we teach writing, we often emphasize thesis writing. You're told that you need to have a claim. In the 5 paragraph essay model, that claim comes in the first paragraph, right? And so, in a well-written piece of student writing, let's say in the 5 paragraph mode, it's generally pretty hard to miss the argument, right? Like that's kind of front and center, and it might even get repeated a few times in the rest of the essay. But in more sophisticated writing and writing that's longer, a lot of times writers sort of the argument might come later in the essay than being stated right at the beginning. Um, One of the dangers of that strategy is that your reader may get a few paragraphs into your essay and not know what your argument is. And I think this is where a title can kind of help the reader predict what the argument is, right? The danger of a single story, that pretty much lays out the argument within the title. Um, the lab that you did on argument parts kind of is intended to help you think through this issue of, how do we figure out what an argument is when it might be chopped up and kind of served to us in little chunks throughout the entirety of an essay. Okay. But I thought that this passage, maybe as well as any other passage in the essay, kind of clearly laid out her claim in a mode of logos. Okay. So she is she's telling us what the problem is. Here she's making a distinction. She's saying it's not the stereotypes are that they come out of nowhere or they're completely untrue, but they don't tell us the whole story. So I thought that was a nicely nuanced point. And then she makes a kind of further claim in the next paragraph. She says the consequence of the single story is this: it robbed us of our dignity. So that's like a good example of it extending an initial argument and deepening it, if you will, or complicating it, right? Giving us the ramifications or the consequences of a claim. Okay. Now, I think if you watch the TED Talk version, the spoken version of this essay that Adichie gave, I think she's got a great, like, really warm presence, and she's very funny, I thought. And I think part of what makes her so um, convincing is that she's very candid about her own blind spots and her own shortcomings. She uses a lot of self-deprecating humor, and she's not afraid. She doesn't seem to be trying to convince us that she's blameless or that she's a perfect person. And I think she does this very strategically, um, in a way that's very successful in building what we would call ethos, right? When we feel like someone's being fair-minded, um, we tend to have more faith in what they're saying. Okay, so I thought that there's a really interesting example here from her upbringing with a houseboy named Fide who works in her middle class Nigerian home. Okay, so she says, I come from a conventional middle class Nigerian family. My father was a professor, my mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family, and when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know, people like Fide's family have nothing." So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit, and his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Okay, and here she's demonstrating through a personal story how, our knowledge is not only an asset, right? It can also sometimes produce blind spots, right? The thing that you know can kind of get in the way of something that you don't yet know. And this is why she's going to go on to advocate for um, not necessarily getting rid of the first story, but just adding more voices to the mix so that you can kind of get a multi-perspectival read on things and thereby kind of get closer to the truth. Okay. Um, Okay, now this this little story about Fide reminded me a lot of one of my favorite films, Y tu mamá también, by Alfonso Cuarón. It's a Mexican film, and the premise is that there's two teenage boys living in Mexico City, and they're quite alike, but one of them is from a wealthier family, and the other one is from a kind of middle class or lower middle class family, and they both end up having a kind of crush on the same woman, and some tensions arrive in a kind of classic love triangle story. But the wealthier boy has live-in domestic help, right? And I'm going to show you two short clips of scenes that kind of feature this woman who's a domestic servant who has actually taken on a fairly important role in this young man's life. She's in effect, she's kind of raised him since he was a child. And the first clip I'm going to show you, we're going to see him being like quite dismissive of her or sort of not noticing her as she's serving him. I think she brings him the telephone and a sandwich, and he doesn't seem to really view her in her full humanity. And then later he's on a road trip and they pass by the village that she came from in the countryside, and he kind of has this realization that, oh, that this woman has a whole backstory that is very real. And the film doesn't linger on it too long, but it's a really kind of interesting moment to put it side by side with the Fide story from Adichie. So let me show that to you.
Ya no, ¿qué te pasa? Ya no estás bien, cariño. Es que me acosté con ella. Te digo que soy una mierda. Luisa. qué me dices esto? Te quiero un chingo. Solo porque me dices. ¿Ya no? Luisa. Aquí está tu platillo con la norteñita. Le puse el queso que pediste. Gracias, no. Bueno, un momentito, por favor. Es para ti. Toma, se toma. Bueno. Se sabe. Hola, toma. Soy Luisa. Sabe, vale. ¿Sí? Luisa, la española. ¿Sí? Sí, sí, sí. ¿Qué pasó? ¿Cómo estás?
Tenoch pensó que nunca había visitado Tepelmeme, el pueblo natal de Leodegaria Victoria, Leo, su nana, quien a los 13 años emigró a la Ciudad de México. Leo encontró trabajo en casa de los Iturbide y estuvo al cuidado de Tenoch desde recién nacido. Hasta los 4 años le decía mamá. Tenoch no hizo comentario alguno.
Okay, so a couple things I wanted to point out about those two clips. First of all, Cuarón is a master of the cut, right? This transition from one scene to the next. And I think that the this kind of upswelling of emotion that Luisa feels uh, makes us sort of not notice something in the next scene. Okay, so just to give you a little context, Luisa has recently found out that she has a terminal case of cancer. She's got months to live, and she calls her husband. They're separated for a time because of travel, and she's going to finally tell her husband that she's dying. And before she gets a chance to tell him, he tells her that he's been having an affair. So you can imagine how crushing this moment is, and she begins crying. And it's really the actress is so good. There's this kind of visceral emotion. Then the scene ends and it cuts to what feels like this very kind of everyday scene of a servant walking through a palatial kitchen and up the stairs. And at first blush, it feels sort of like we're kind of waiting for the next thing to happen. And we've been trained by film to view characters like this as just sort of filler or things that happen in passing while we're waiting for the star of the show to take up space in the scene. And when she gets upstairs, she serves the teenage guy, and he doesn't even answer the phone when it's ringing, and he doesn't really acknowledge her. And so we feel that he's kind of probably like an annoying kid to work for, right? Later in the film, we get to the scene in the second clip in which he's driving through the countryside in Mexico, and he encounters her home village, and he has this sort of almost an epiphany. Like it kind of occurs to him that, he used to call her mom, we're told by the voiceover. And this is his first time maybe considering the kind of fullness of her life before she moved to Mexico City. Interestingly, that scene ends with the voiceover telling us that although he was thinking about this staring out the car window, he didn't tell anyone. So it's Cuarón does this a lot. Characters kind of get close to having revelations that might kind of expand their mind and then draw back from them. I think partially because the new information kind of threatens their identity or their worldview. Okay. Um, all right. This brings us to Richard Rorty. So Rorty is a philosopher, um, kind of active from the 70s through the early 2000, well, 2000 teens. And he has this concept I'm really fascinated by, which he calls final vocabularies. Okay, so he says all human beings carry about a set of words which they employ to justify their actions, their beliefs, and their lives. These are the words in which we formulate praise of our friends and contempt for our enemies, our long-term projects, our deepest self-doubts, and our highest hopes. They are the words in which we tell, sometimes prospectively and sometimes retrospectively, the story of our lives. I shall call these words a person's final vocabulary. Okay, so for the Socrates character who shows up in Plato, if you've ever read Platonic dialogues, um, something like the good or the beautiful or the true would be an example of a term cast in a final vocabulary. Okay. Um, Rorty continues, it is final in the sense that if doubt is cast on the worth of these words, their user has no non-circular argumentative recourse. Those words are as far as he can go with the language. Beyond them, there is only helpless passivity or a resort to force. A small part of a final vocabulary is made up of thin, flexible, and ubiquitous terms such as true, good, right, and beautiful. The larger part contains thicker, more rigid, and more parochial terms. For example, Christ, England, professional standards, decency, kindness, the revolution, the church, progressive, rigorous, creative. The more parochial terms do most of the work. And by parochial here, he means kind of narrowly defined, right? So if you're a soldier being asked to go to war to defend your country and you have doubts and your commander says you must do it for England, that is an instance of a final vocabulary insofar as it if you say, well, yeah, but what is England? Like you probably won't get very far. Either people will sort of look at you with passivity, like, what are you, stupid? You don't know what England is, or force. They'll say, well, you have to do it at the point of a gun. Okay. I shall define an ironist, Rorty continues, as someone who fulfills three conditions. She has radical and continuing doubts about the final vocabulary she currently uses because she has been impressed by other vocabularies, vocabularies taken as final by people or books she has encountered. She realizes that two, she realizes that argument phrased in her present vocabulary can neither underwrite nor dissolve these doubts. Three, insofar as she philosophizes about her situation, she does not think that her vocabulary is closer to reality than others, that it is in touch with a power not herself. So the ironist is someone who has a kind of healthy doubt about how certain they can be, even about things they're quite certain about, right? So if you were a devout um, believer in a given religion, but you're also an ironist, you might sort of recognize that other people of religious faith may be just as genuine in their faith as you. And you may be open to kind of hearing out arguments for maybe the case for atheism, for instance. Okay, so you don't have like 100% certainty that the story you've been told is the correct story, and that all other stories are wrong. Okay, so Rorty says, I call people of this sort ironists because their realization that anything can be made to look good or bad by being redescribed. Okay, so here, redescription for Rorty is a really important part of not just of our reading lives or the way we kind of take in culture, but also democracy itself, right? That a certain openness to hearing people out when they want to describe something you value in a new way is a real cornerstone of the democratic political process. Kind of in much the same way that dialogue and conversation are so central in the Socratic dialogues. Okay, this part I find really interesting. He says the opposite of irony is common sense. For that is the watchword of those who unselfconsciously describe everything important in terms of the final vocabulary to which they and those around them are habituated. To be commonsensical is to take for granted that statements formulated in that final vocabulary suffice to describe and fudge the beliefs, actions, and lives of those who employ alternative final vocabularies. Okay, so what he means here, I'm really fascinated by this because what he's saying is that if we have this value that we should be open to redescription and learning new ways of describing things, right? We might think that the opposite of that was something really nasty or you know something that would appear to us as kind of negative and closed-minded. But Rorty says that's not actually how it works. The way it works is um, that the opposite of that kind of open-minded point of view is just common sense, right? It's like the things that we know so well that we don't even question them, right? And sometimes if you ever travel to a very different culture, you'll sort of realize that you have these beliefs or practices or habits that you may not even have been aware that you had, right? And you often can kind of retrospectively look back at the culture you're coming from and notice certain things about it in the light of this new version of common sense. Okay. Now, why do I bring Rorty into this conversation? Well, I think that Adichie is a really, and Baldwin, they're both really great exemplars of the ironist frame of mind, right? They are constantly on the lookout for kind of different ways of viewing problems, different ways of interpreting their past experiences. Okay. Now, Adichie makes several allusions. An allusion is a reference to something outside the text that you're reading. So usually they're like works of art, authors, writers, cultural figures. A lot of texts are kind of talking to one another, right? And so um, they're kind of maybe quoting other literary texts or what have you. And sprinkled throughout Adichie's talk, there are a handful of allusions that I think are really interesting. So she says, I recently spoke at a university where a student told me that it was such a shame that Nigerian men were physical abusers, like the father character in my novel. I told him that I had just read a novel called American Psycho, and that it was such a shame that young Americans were serial murderers. Now, American Psycho is a 1991 novel by Bret Easton Ellis, whose um, hero is a kind of villainous guy named Patrick Bateman. We can see here he's got the knife out. He's a very kind of slick, psychopathic person. And the point she's making here is that and there was a kind of a laugh line. If you watch the TED Talk, you'll notice the crowd kind of erupts in recognizing the ridiculousness of this situation because anyone in the United States who has read American Psycho just kind of inherently understands that Patrick Bateman does not represent an average American male, right? Like he is uniquely problematic, right? And so, in the same way, what Adichie is kind of asking of her audience is to not take one example of a Nigerian family as depicted in a novel and think that like it represents the entire culture, right? And I thought this was a great example of humor as a form of pathos. I think pathos, you know, if we think back on the first film clip, one of the things that pathos does is it can kind of overwhelm us, or it can really like affect our state of mind. And in the cut to watching the maid walk up the stairs, it's almost as if we have a hangover from having watched Louisa cry, and we maybe don't have the resources of focus that Cuarón wants us to have to actually think about this wage worker woman as she's serving this rich kid in his mansion. Um, and I think that Adichie uses humor a few times in her talk in really effective ways. Another laugh line is when her college roommate is surprised. She wants to hear her music, and the roommate is expecting to hear African tribal drumming and you know maybe more like cultural music. And what she gets instead is Mariah Carey. And this is sort of ironic and funny at the same time because Mariah Carey was this world famous pop star, very prominent in the 1990s, and was maybe just not what the audience knows that the college roommate is not expecting this student from Africa to be a fan of Mariah Carey, right? And this sort of shows the limitations of the roommate's perspectives on the world, not kind of understanding that global pop superstardom is a thing by the 90s, and you know, it's actually not that surprising that a student from Nigeria would know who Mariah Carey was. Okay, there's another couple of illusions that I want to point out just to wrap up here. And so I'm using this literary term allusion, but I want to point out that I think in some instances the allusion is working in a mode of pathos, and in others it's working in a mode of ethos. Now, what I mean by ethos here is that one of the kind of effects or results of allusive writing is it's kind of a way of demonstrating your mastery of a field, right? When writers or professors kind of refer to uh, related works, that can build up the credibility of the presenter because it gives you a sense that they have a wider field of knowledge that they can draw on, right? Of course, it can also be kind of obnoxious if someone's too heavy-handed about it, but I think that Adichie here weaves it into the fabric of her story in a really lovely way. So she invokes the name Alice Walker. Now, Alice Walker wrote The Color Purple. It was turned into a movie that starred Oprah Winfrey. It was a huge phenomenon of a novel. And this is what Adichie says about Walker. The American writer Alice Walker wrote this about her Southern relatives who had moved to the North. She introduced them to a book about the Southern life that they had left behind. They sat around reading the book themselves, listening to me read the book, and a kind of paradise was regained. Now, she's referring to a lot of the former slaves, once they were freed after the Civil War, moved north to cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York. And, one of the kind of interesting aspects of that cultural story is that they had cultural roots and family ties in the South, but are now living in northern cities. And as the generations go by, those threads start to fray a little bit. And so art that was able to retell those stories could seem very meaningful to that audience. But I bolded this phrase "paradise was regained" because I think that this is a kind of subtle allusion to another writer in English, John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost in the 1600s. Um, Paradise Lost is one of the many people call it the greatest work of poetry in the English language. It's very, very canonical. It was sort of almost unavoidable if you were an English major for literally hundreds of years. And it tells the story of Satan being cast out of heaven after he rebels against God. And the poem opens up with Satan kind of rallying the troops, planning how they're going to make their comeback by kind of infiltrating humanity and turning them against God. And so here in this version of a book cover, we have Satan having kind of been cast down into the pit of hell. And it's very subtle, but it just in using that phrase "paradise regained," she's kind of subtly pointing at Milton's Paradise Lost. And I think that this goes towards ethos in the sense that while Adichie, she herself is part of this movement to kind of diversify the writers that are viewed as canonical. And by canonical, I mean taught in schools, studied, reviews are written about those books, right? That they're kind of brought into the cultural conversation and kind of ascribed a certain value. She's been telling us that we need to kind of like open things up, right? And I think that this move here, where she's just sort of obliquely gesturing to Milton, she's kind of reminding us that, we she's not saying we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater. She's not saying that she hasn't read all of those, what we might think of as like old school English major texts. But that by bringing in someone like Alice Walker into conversation with a Milton or a Shakespeare, we might have a kind of fuller, richer version of the human stories that are being told. Okay, so I will leave it there. I'm trying to think if there's any. I would be really interested in hearing what you thought about the Adichie TED Talk, if you liked it as much as me, because I think it's just a really well crafted piece of writing and public performance, and it feels on first blush, I think it comes across as kind of casual, but when you sit down and you read the text and you really pay close attention to it, you can see the level of craft in her the structure and the kind of richness that she brings to it. So I hope you enjoyed it, and I will get back with you next week for the next lecture.